One thing that you may notice by looking at energy pyramid diagrams, no matter what form they're in or specific organisms that they contain, they're always going to be limited to about 5 trophic levels. So really only to the quaternary consumer level. And that's because the number of levels, the number of trophic levels that an ecosystem can support is limited to that because energy is lost as it is transferred up in trophic levels. The majority of that energy is lost, about 90%. And that's because energy is stored in organisms as biomass, that sugar and starch that we talked about. But as primary consumers consume producers, they can only access about 10% of that energy that producers stored because 90% of that was lost as heat through the metabolic processes of the producers themselves. And then when secondary consumers eat a primary consumer, another 90% of that energy is lost to the metabolic processes of the primary consumer. So only about 10% of the energy can be transferred from one trophic level to the next. And that's why ecosystems typically don't have more than 4 or 5 trophic levels. And then sometimes, if nutrient availability is scarce, then you'll even see fewer trophic levels. But a healthy ecosystem can have really up to 5. Because by the time you get to quaternary consumers, they have to be able to eat a lot more and a more diverse number of things to meet those energy demands that they have. Because not only are they larger animals, typically, those predator animals, they're also having to consume more to account for that energy that's lost. So when we were looking at our food web before, we saw that many arrows were pointing to those quaternary consumers, in this case the buzzard and the fox, and they need to have that more diverse diet to be able to meet all of their energy needs because all of the organisms below them on that trophic pyramid are using up energy as they consume it themselves. So in addition to energy moving through ecosystems, we are also going to need to see nutrients and other resources cycled through an ecosystem to make sure that they're available to all organisms. And unlike energy that's input into the environment through sunlight and harnessed through photosynthesis and then lost through respiration and metabolism, nutrients are not added to the biosphere and then used up. All of the nutrients that exist now, all that there will ever be and all that there ever has been. So you kind of you hear that, when we're talking about the amount of water in the ecosystem, the amount of fresh water that's available, we talk about how the same water that we drank is the same water that dinosaurs did. And that's true because we are just cycling that through ecosystems and around the biosphere. So the same nitrogen atoms and carbon atoms and water molecules that made up prehistoric creatures are the same atoms and molecules that make us up today and everything else. And these resources, these nutrients, follow predictable cycles that demonstrate how they're used, stored, released, and then used again and again. So we're going to focus on 3 of the big ones. We're going to look at the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle as examples of this. But all nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, all of the ones that we've seen, sodium in our body systems throughout the semester, all have their own processes of cycling. So we're going to focus on those big 3. The water cycle. Water has been such an important component of all of our body systems that we've looked at, and the water cycle keeps water in the environment and available for consumption by organisms. And because it's a cycle, it's continuous, so it really doesn't matter with which step you start. So let's start with precipitation. Water stored in clouds falls to the ground as rain or snow. And once it falls to the ground, that water will flow from streams to rivers and eventually to oceans. And along the way, or once it gets into the ocean, water will then be evaporated by being converted from a liquid, water, to a gas by the heat of the sun. And then that evaporated water will condense back down into clouds. And then once it's condensed, it will fall to the ground via precipitation, and the cycle will start all over again. So that's really important in moving water around ecosystems. That keeps our crops hydrated, that makes fresh water available to ecosystems that even may be at higher elevations. The condensation into the clouds is what, and then the movement of the clouds via wind is what allows water to be moved back into an ecosystem that maybe doesn't exist at a lower level where water would be draining to. So really, really important that we're able to move water around and make it available to organisms that wouldn't have direct access to standing water. The carbon cycle. So we've also seen carbon a lot in the body systems. Carbon makes up the ring structures of sugars, such as the backbones of DNA and RNA, and the chains of glucose that we saw make up our molecules of ATP that we use for energy. And the carbon cycle moves carbon from living organisms back into environment, back into the ecosystem, and then makes it available for use by other organisms. Carbon moves from the environment into organisms when producers convert carbon dioxide into sugars during photosynthesis. So another key element to fueling the carbon cycle is the input of that energy from the sun, because one of the ingredients that goes into photosynthesis is carbon dioxide. So when herbivores consume the producers, they then consume the carbon that they've fixed from the atmosphere. And the carbon is then passed along up the trophic levels, just like we saw energy pass through. Then, when an organism dies, its carbon molecules are broken down and used by decomposers. So all organisms release carbon dioxide back into the environment through respiration, which then can be fixed again by photosynthesis. Carbon can also be stored in some places for long periods of time. We can see that in the wood of trees, in sedimentary rock, or in fossil fuels like oil and coal. And there are 3 processes that can lead to stored carbon being released back into the environment. We've got decomposition, which is what we mentioned before, and then we have erosion or combustion. So decomposition, we've seen that happen already when the tree, for example, dies, and then the process of decomposers breaking it down makes the carbon stored there available again. Carbon stored in rocks is released through erosion by wind or water, and the carbon stored in fossil fuels is released very quickly by combustion or burning it. This would be one example of one of the ways that humans have altered the carbon cycle, which is to release large amounts of carbon into the atmosphere by combustion. So you'll read a lot more about that in chapter 25, and hopefully you can refer back to this image and this description of the carbon cycle as one of your examples of how humans may have impacted nutrient cycling. Nitrogen is another main component of many of life's major molecules, like the nitrogenous bases of DNA and RNA, or the main component of amino acid chains, proteins. And nitrogen is fixed from the environment and made available to organisms by being converted from nitrogen gas to ammonium. And one of the really cool things about the nitrogen cycle is that it's fueled by bacteria. So the fixation that's done by nitrogen going from the nitrogen gas in the air to that other molecule of ammonium is performed by nitrogen fixing bacteria. And only those bacteria are capable of performing this important task. And without that bacteria, we wouldn't be able to access any of the nitrogen from the environment. And that nitrogen fixing bacteria is found most commonly in the nodes or little nodules of leguminous plants like peas and alfalfa. So you'll often see like farmers planting cover crops, and most cover crops happen to be a legume like a clover or alfalfa, and that's because the job of those plants is to fix nitrogen back into the soil, and that's because they contain nitrogen-fixing bacteria. After that nitrogen is fixed by being converted from N2 to ammonium by that nitrogen-fixing bacteria, the next step is nitrification, which converts the ammonium to nitrates and nitrites. And again, this is done by nitrifying bacteria in the soil. Ammonium and nitrates can be absorbed by plants and used to make their proteins and their amino acids. And then that nitrogen, those molecules of ammonium and nitrates, is passed up the trophic level through the food web. So again, those producers, they're not producing the nitrogen, but they are allowing it to enter into the environment through the food web. And then the last step is denitrification, which involves the conversion of those nitrates back to nitrogen gas, N2. When plants and animals that contain that fixed nitrogen pass away, decomposing bacteria break it down back into ammonia. So again, fueled by bacteria, the entire nitrogen cycle. And then a lot of that ammonium is converted back into nitrates via nitrification. The rest is converted back into nitrogen gas by those other bacteria and then returned to the atmosphere so that it can be transported to other ecosystems or other places within that ecosystem. Denitrification is most commonly happening in wet soil, swamps, and estuary type environments. And that's important that denitrification happen in those locations because otherwise the nitrogen would just collect there and would have no way out. So if nitrogen in the soil is drained down into these swampy areas and then it had no way to escape that, then it would not be cycled back into the environment. So denitrification is a way of releasing that nitrogen that otherwise would have been lost back to be available again to those other organisms. Just like we saw in the carbon cycle, the burning of fossil fuels by humans has also disrupted the nitrogen cycle. So you'll read more about that as well in chapter 25. Biomagnification. So energy and nutrients really aren't the only thing that are moved through the environment through organisms. Another example would also be contaminants, things that we don't really want. Those are also cycled through systems. And because organisms at higher trophic levels have to eat more to meet their energy needs, that means that they're also eating more contaminants from the environment, which results in biomagnification. Biomagnification is the increasing concentration of toxins in organisms at higher trophic levels due to their consumption of more organisms from lower trophic levels. Unlike essential nutrients that are cycled really quickly through the body systems, toxins are often stored in fatty tissue, like the liver, kidneys, or intestinal fat, which can then affect the functioning of those organisms. A really common example of this is mercury levels in fish. If mercury is present in an ocean environment, it will be absorbed by all of the organisms that are exposed to the contamination. So krill and small plankton are eating the plant producers, and they're going to be exposed to small amounts of mercury in the water. But the mercury that is absorbed by the krill is consumed by fish at the next trophic level, like the salmon in this image. And then the salmon are then consumed by tertiary consumers like tuna, and then the tuna are consumed by quaternary consumers, in this case the shark. And as you go up in trophic levels, energy is lost, as we saw before. So animals at higher trophic levels have to eat more biomass to meet their energy needs. And in that biomass, they're accumulating more mercury, which results in higher levels of contamination at higher trophic levels. So the shark will have more effects of mercury contamination than the salmon or the krill. And that's why there are warnings on how much fish of certain types that people should consume, because fish at higher trophic levels are going to contain more mercury and thus pose a greater risk to humans when they consume them. And I will conclude this chapter in a third video.